Hi, mentalists. Today we are discussing David Chalmers. Today we are discussing David Chalmers' Consciousness and Its Place in Nature. This is a long paper, but the majority of it is really just dedicated to discussing different materialist responses to these epistemic arguments that we've read, like Nagel's argument and Jackson's argument. And Chalmers is going to criticize each of these responses for being inadequate. At the very end of the paper, he also gives us a couple of alternative options to materialism and assesses them. Now, for today's lecture, I won't be focusing on those quite as much because we'll be discussing them for next time when we discuss his other paper on panpsychism and panprotopsychism. So for now, we'll just be focusing on the first part where he talks about what he calls type A materialism, type B materialism, and type C materialism as responses to these epistemic arguments. So what I have for you today is a PowerPoint explaining Chalmers' paper, and it'll be useful for me. It'll be useful for me and little Jaja here as we go over these different options and help us keep them straight, because it can get confusing pretty quickly, and I find a visual very, very helpful. Consciousness and Its Place in Nature by David Chalmers. Here's a summary that he gives us of what he sees as 3 different epistemic arguments against materialism. You might recognize these as the conceivability or zombie argument, the knowledge argument that Jackson gives, and the subjectivity argument that Nagel gives. So this is a summary. Chalmers thinks they all share this feature. 1, there's an epistemic gap between physical and phenomenal truths. 2, if there's an epistemic gap, then it suggests that there's an ontological gap, and materialism is false. So materialism is false. And Chalmers is going to defend the idea that there is an ontological gap here. So he'll be interested in exploring what the different types of resistance are to saying that there's this epistemic gap, or to saying that if there is an epistemic gap, it doesn't mean that there has to be an ontological gap. So he suggests 3 ways that a materialist might resist these arguments. And he calls them by these very unhelpful names. He calls them type A materialism, type B materialism, and type C materialism. And these are not names that are typically used by other people when writing about these things, so you don't have to use these terms unless you're specifically writing about this Chalmers paper. So type A materialism, he describes as the set of materialist views that see no epistemic gap at all between the phenomenal and the physical. They're the types of people who will say that the epistemic gap is made up, or it's overhyped by qualia freaks, stuff like that. The type B materialists are the people who think that there is an epistemic gap, and they concede that there's an epistemic gap. They agree, for example, that Mary learned something when she leaves the black and white room, but they don't think that this means that there's an ontological gap. Type C materialists are a category we haven't seen a lot of. They're the ones who think that there is an epistemic gap, but it's closable in principle. That is, like, right now we don't know why there's an epistemic gap, and we can't quite figure out the problem, but these people think that one day we will be able to figure out the problem, or maybe we won't because there's a psychological limitation. But in principle, it's a closable gap. Like if we were smarter creatures than we are, or something like that. If we weren't like the equivalent of these slug scientists, slug philosophers under the sea, you know? So let's explore each of these types of materialism in a little more detail and see what Chalmers' complaints are about each one. Right, so this is just my note. These terms are confusing. You don't need to use this categorization yourself. So type A materialism. Type A materialism, according to Chalmers, sees no epistemic gap between the physical and phenomenal truths, or at least any apparent epistemic gap is easily closed. So what this means is that, according to the type A materialist, zombies are just not conceivable. We reject that there are zombies that we can imagine, and also because of that there are zombies that are possible in some alternative scenario. It's just not the case. There are no zombies. There can be no zombies of the phenomenal kind. They will also say that Mary is not ignorant of any phenomenal truths, so she doesn't learn anything when she leaves the room. if she really knows all the physical facts, she just will know what red looks like before she leaves the room. She won't be surprised upon seeing the apple. And finally, the thing that Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, figuring out why red feels like anything and what makes red feel red as opposed to some other sensation, that hard problem boils down to the easy problems. The easy problems are what Chalmers thinks are like these problems of figuring out the neural correlates of consciousness, or kind of the ways in which your physical system integrates information in the world to produce kind of an experiential manifold, all of those different, like the binding problem and things like that. Those problems are maybe tricky and difficult and will take a lot of work, but those aren't as hard as the hard problem, which is what Chalmers thinks is the problem of figuring out why consciousness arises from a material system. And you might ask, what are examples of type A materialism? I've mentioned these in class. We haven't really read anybody directly defending one of these views, but these are views like eliminativism about the mental, people who think that there are no phenomenal things over and above the physical. There's just the physical substance, just the physical properties, and so maybe we should stop talking in this misleading way. Those are eliminativists. Analytic functionalists are another kind of type A materialist, and we talked about these briefly in class, but these are people that think that mental terms are ontologically reducible to like input-output terms, you know, like stimulus and behavioral response terms, for example, that all of that can be analyzed. Sorry, that all of these mental terms can be analyzed down into all of these observable physical terms. That's analytic functionalism. So it ends up being unnecessary to speak of, or the mental processes in and of themselves. You can always specify them in other terms. And so there's a sense in which there's not really a gap, an epistemic gap. And finally, logical behaviorism, which is similar to analytic functionalism. It just sort of restricts the domain of things you can talk about even a little bit more than analytic functionalism. Now, some of these views, like eliminativist views, might be psychoneural identity views, but they can also be views that talk about like environmental influences and how environmental influences determine physical characteristics and mental characteristics definitively. They can be kinds of like biological naturalist views that are not necessarily psychoneural identity. So Chalmers calls all of these type A materialism. There's just no gap. Mary doesn't learn anything new. Zombies are not conceivable. The hard problem isn't really a hard problem. So what does he have to say about type A materialism? Chalmers thinks that type A materialism is untenable because consciousness is a special kind of concept. There is a disanalogy between consciousness on the one hand and other concepts that have been explained away or reduced in the past. Like, for example, the vitalist life concept. So way back in the beginning of the semester, I mentioned vitalism as an example of how people used to think about the definition of life and how it remained tenable for a while until we understood the way in which you could understand life defined in a kind of biological functional way. And some people think that consciousness can be explained away in this way. As soon as we develop our scientific concepts enough, we'll be able to move past finding these dualist options for consciousness viable. But Chalmers thinks that consciousness is unlike the concept of life. It's special. The thing that we're missing in not yet being able to explain life in a non-vitalist way was some kind of animating principle, something that explains why organisms move and eat and are active and are responsive to their environment. And vitalism posited a sort of special spirit thing that did all this stuff, like a special energy spirit, but you don't need the energy spirit once you understand the physical principles behind motion. Nonetheless, consciousness, Chalmers thinks, is like ontologically distinctive because it's something about our immediate experience. It's something that's like, you know, right here, you know, like the Cartesian theater might be an illusion, but it's very compelling, the sense that we're seeing the world from like behind our eyes, the sense that this experiential manifold is what makes up our own selves. It's sort of, for Chalmers, just it's like a different type of problem altogether than oh, look, there's a scientific term that we're still investigating. Let's figure out what it is. Consciousness sort of presents its own problem because of its self-presentation being essential to itself, right? Our access to ourselves is just sort of core. This subjective feature is unlike the feature in any other concept either. So essentially, Chalmers just thinks that because of the sort of thing consciousness is and the sort of way in which we know primitively about consciousness, it's not going to be easy to wave away in the way that type A materialist wants to. Chalmers also argues that most of the more compelling arguments for type A materialism are indirect. So they use the costs or the consequences of not accepting type A materialism as kind of a prod for accepting type A materialism. Like, oh, if you don't accept eliminativism about the mental, if you don't say like the mental is not at all its own category and like we can't talk about consciousness, then there's this horrible thing that's going to happen. We're going to have to admit this like unexplainable type of property in the world, and that's really costly, and so you should accept type A materialism. That's the kind of thing Chalmers calls an indirect argument. It's not like an in itself reason for accepting the view. Eliminativism doesn't provide its own intrinsic benefits. Instead, the reason to accept eliminativism is just if you don't like any of the alternative options and you still want to be a materialist, for example. So according to Chalmers, each one still needs to be supplemented by direct arguments, reasons to adopt the view in and of itself, why it's a sufficient view. And a lot of these views do provide such direct arguments, but they haven't been as compelling traditionally as the problems that people have with them, the costs that people see of adopting type A materialist views. Like analytic functionalism and ontological behaviorism and eliminativism all mean that there's certain types of things you just can't talk about anymore. And that's very hard. And there was a time when people sort of adopted those strategies, but it was very uncomfortable and it made it difficult to look like you were really studying the phenomena that you claimed to set out to study. So type A materialism, still viable, still popular, but for philosophical reasons, Chalmers thinks it's a subpar view. Maybe you disagree with him. So let's move on. Now let's talk about type B materialism. Type B materialism is more like the kind that we've been reading about so far, and more like the kind that we'll read about more later in the semester. So type B materialists concede that there is an epistemic gap. They sort of feel the pull of these epistemic arguments, and they say, yeah, no, there is this strange puzzle. Consciousness is special, and it's interesting, and it's its own important problem. But the type B materialists don't think that this should lead us to think that there is an ontological gap. So the mere fact that we have a difference in how we epistemically access these two features of ourselves, our conscious selves and our physical selves, doesn't necessitate an ontological gap. So according to the type B materialist, zombies are conceivable. Yeah, our imagination can produce these physical replicas that have nothing conscious in them, but it's not actually possible for there to be zombies. So we can imagine them, but that doesn't mean they're possible. Also, they'll say that Mary is, in fact, when she leaves the room, she learns something. She's ignorant of some phenomenal truths, but these truths concern an underlying physical reality, or we can explain how the things she doesn't know aren't a problem for materialism. On this view, the hard problem doesn't require a, quote, distinct ontological domain. So the hard problem is a problem for getting us to understand the world we live in, and type B materialists acknowledge that there's kind of an understanding problem, but they don't think that at the end of the day, there's an ontological issue. The problem we have in grasping how the world is physical is not in itself a problem for the world being physical. So Chalmers tells us that the most common kinds of theories that fall under type B materialism are identity theories. So these are the ones where the concepts that we have are identified a posteriori, so after we look at the world empirically, and that explains some of the epistemic gap. So I have this concept of consciousness, and I have this concept of my body, but the identification doesn't happen until after I do a lot of thinking and cogitating and studying the world and experimenting and finding correlations. And then I find an a posteriori, after my experience, necessity, like an identity. So this is a view like Smart's, right? So Smart thinks that sensations are brain processes, but this isn't an analytic truth. It's not something that's essential to the concept of sensation. It's something we find out about. Oh, look, we learned something. Sensations are brain processes. So there is an epistemic gap because you don't start out already knowing that the two are the same. But once you find it out, you can kind of make sense of why you were confused in the first place. So identity theories are a natural fit here because the identity theories are things we come to after we study the world. So what are Chalmers' problems with type B materialism? First of all, he again says that there's a disanalogy between explanation for other domains and explanation of consciousness and psychology. He concedes that while identities may be discovered empirically, he says, quote, it's not epistemically primitive. So it's not known analytically or a priori, right? That minds and brains might be identical, or that minds and functions might be identical. So while identity may be empirical, it's not epistemically primitive, but the type B materialist is stuck with this because they must hold that it is not deducible from the complete physical truth as a means of explaining that there is an epistemic gap. For example, Kripke says that pains are rigid designators, and they rigidly designate something that's not essentially physical. Pains are things that we might find out are identical with physical objects, but a priori, this is not clear. And so there's going to be a gap in my knowing the physical stuff and my knowing the sensation stuff, according to Kripke. And that gap is going to be enough for us to get these metaphysical arguments that are problematic. So the only way out of the conceivability argument that Chalmers gives in his opinion is if you deny that you can't epistemically derive analytically or a priori the physical stuff from the mental stuff, or vice versa. Basically what we're saying is type B materialists, they grant that identity is something you find out a posteriori or empirically, and because it's not epistemically primitive that this identity holds, but the type B materialist needs that primitiveness if he's going to avoid the conceivability argument, then they get in trouble. Chalmers presses on the worry that once again, consciousness is special, and that the consciousness identities will be disanalogous with other kinds of identities, such that the explanation offered by an identity will be unsatisfying. So the identity theorist here, the type B materialist, is left with giving an identity in order to get rid of an explanatory problem, but it's going to turn out that when you give an identity, it doesn't always get rid of the explanatory problem. And in the case of consciousness, because it is special, it actually just sort of reintroduces the problem. So we end up asking, right, why is it the case that when this particular chunk of brain is activated, it feels like red and not like blue? Like, what makes the red feelings be happening when this brain activation happens and not the blue feelings? I can conceive of the blue feelings happening instead of the red feelings. And so there's a sense in which if I just say, well, it's because the sensation is identical to this particular brain process, you can still ask why, because there's an epistemic gap. And so the explanation offered by the identity doesn't stop those questions from coming. And there's a sense in which it's like a not fully adequate explanation. Whereas if you asked such a follow-up question after someone gave you the definition, heat is molecular kinetic energy, and you were like, but wait, how is heat molecular kinetic energy? And you're like, no, I just told you they're identical. There's sort of no epistemic gap left unless you didn't understand the terms or something. But because consciousness is something first personal, there's always going to be a problem in grasping how that first personal thing corresponds to this third person description of the thing that it's supposed to be identical to. And so type B materialism has an intrinsic explanatory problem, according to Chalmers. For him, that's enough of a reason not to accept type B materialism. But just in case you thought this argument isn't good enough against the type B materialist, he has another one. And this is Chalmers's argument. He calls it the two-dimensional argument. Okay, so let's try to go over Chalmers's two-dimensional argument. And the two-dimensional here refers to his two-dimensional semantics, which is messy. So remember how we were talking about in class very briefly how some people think that one way to avoid the conceivability argument, the zombie argument, is to say that maybe conceivability doesn't entail possibility. And if conceivability doesn't entail possibility, then we're home free. Chalmers has an argument that tries to show that even if you thought conceivability doesn't entail possibility, you might still be in trouble because of this conception of the meaning of sentences, the meaning of words in our language that Chalmers has called two-dimensional semantics. And it's a bit tricky, so the details are going to be necessarily a little murky here, but I'll do my best to explain it. So Chalmers' argument basically says that type B materialism won't work as a response to these epistemic problems because he thinks that zombie worlds are an epistemic possibility, even if you grant that they're a distinct type of possibility from Kripkean metaphysical possibility. So even if you think that conceivability and Kripkean metaphysical possibility come apart, there's still a sense of possible. And so it's still, in a sense, a problem for materialism. For Chalmers, what it means to say that we could genuinely conceive of something being the case is that it could turn out to be the case for all we know before we investigate the world. So when we say we can conceive of something, what we mean is before we investigate the world, it's an open possibility for us that it could be the case. So suppose that I am a medieval scholar and I'm interested in studying the elements or something, and I'm moving into the Renaissance and I'm doing a lot of alchemy and I'm trying to figure out what things are real and what things are not real. And for a while there was this element called phlogiston that they believed existed. And at that moment, phlogiston is conceivable. It's conceivable that there be this thing, phlogiston, and that it explains certain kinds of chemical reactions. For all I know, it could turn out to be the case. We know now that actually phlogiston isn't a thing. It's not real. And it doesn't explain anything because it's not real. So it didn't turn out to be a genuine possibility in a sense. So we could conceive of this explanation even though it wasn't actually a physically possible explanation for the state of affairs. And that, for Chalmers, is a case where we are grasping an epistemic possibility. Whether we use the term epistemic possibility or counterfactual possibility, Chalmers argues, just changes how we describe and evaluate possible worlds in such a way that changes what sentences count as true. So if you want to talk about conceivability on the one hand and genuine conceivability on the other or something, where genuine conceivability tracks metaphysical possibility or something, that just changes what sentences we think are true, what sentences we agree are true, but it doesn't necessarily, on his view, change the problem for materialism. How is that the case, Professor O? Well, let me explain it to you. All right, let's see if we can make sense of Chalmers's two-dimensional argument based in two-dimensional semantics against type B materialism. And it's a tricky one, so be forgiving to yourself if you didn't understand what was happening. I'm going to do my best to explain it. So one thing that already makes Chalmers's argument a little suspect is that he's introducing a new way of understanding semantics, which is a branch of linguistics associated with how you define meanings for terms and for sentences and propositions, and how you pick out what things make those sentences true. So he suggests this two-dimensional semantics. And in order to understand two-dimensional semantics, think of the following. So suppose we're wondering whether water is H2O or something like that. Traditionally, on the Kripkean view, water is H2O is a necessary truth. It's true everywhere. There is no world that makes water is H2O false. But suppose you lived in like medieval Europe and you hadn't yet studied the elements. You would not know that water is H2O. And so Chalmers wants to define a way of explaining how you seem to understand that water might not be H2O, that water would turn out to be something other than dihydrogen monoxide. So he calls these two ways of understanding water might not be dihydrogen monoxide the epistemic possibilities, which are the ones that make the medieval man's belief true, and the metaphysical possibilities, or counterfactual possibilities, which would make water is not H2O false. He thinks we can understand both things. So let's define the term verifies, and I'll give you a quote from Chalmers. We can say that if the world considered as actual makes S true, then that world verifies S. So right now we're thinking about worlds in which the medieval man would think those worlds would make his belief that water might not be H2O true. So consider those worlds as if they were actual. Chalmers says those worlds would make his belief true. So we say that those worlds are the ones that verify that sentence. And now define satisfies as the worlds considered as counterfactual. So the worlds where it can't be the case that water is not H2O, like the worlds around here, if you consider those counterfactuals, they make the sentence true, then that's a case in which the world satisfies the sentence. So verification involves the epistemic evaluation of worlds, whereas satisfaction involves the counterfactual evaluation of worlds. Correspondingly, he says, we can associate the sentence with different functions from worlds to truth values. So the epistemic evaluations will make certain sentences true at some times, and the counterfactual evaluations will make those sentences true or false at different times because they're different functions. For example, where S is water is not H2O and W is the XYZ world, we can say that W verifies water is not H2O, but W does not satisfy water is not H2O, given those definitions. Chalmers says later, the moral is that these Kripkean phenomena involve two different ways of thinking of possible worlds, with just one underlying space of worlds. So what Chalmers is saying is like, these are different ways of talking about the same set of objects, the same set of possibilities. It's just that I'm taking ones that wouldn't make the sentence true on a Kripkean analysis and saying, well, these worlds make sentences true on the conceivability scale because they're the ones that you think you're conceiving of. Those worlds are the ones that are possibilities for you epistemically, even if they don't turn out to be actual ways this world could be. And so because they're the same space of worlds, that's his bit of trickery. It'll turn out that even if you think conceivability doesn't entail possibility, conceiving of zombies is already a problem for materialism. So here's the argument. 1, take all of the physical truths that hold and then change one phenomenal truth. Like, for example, zombies are possible, or inverted qualia are a thing. So call that P and not Q. All of the physical truths plus one phenomenal difference. So premise 1, P and not Q is conceivable. Premise 2, if P and not Q is conceivable, then there's a world that verifies P and not Q. Remember, verifies means you consider the epistemic possibility as actual. right? So there is a world that epistemically verifies P and not Q. Premise 3, if a world verifies P and not Q, then a world satisfies P and not Q, or type F monism is true. So if there's a world that verifies P and not Q, then either that world also satisfies P and not Q, because the epistemic possibility is also a counterfactual possibility, or it is the case that some non-materialist view like panprotopsychism is true, because remember, it's the same set of worlds. So the world that verifies P and not Q might not be the world that that is actually, in some sense, metaphysically or counterfactually possible for us around here, but it'll still be a world in which there's an epistemic gap, which has to be explained in some way. So that suggests that basically either materialism is false or materialism is false, if materialism here means something like the identity theory. So premise 4, if a world satisfies P and not Q, then materialism is false. If a world satisfies P and not Q, materialism is false. So materialism is false. Magic, trickery, philosophical cleverness. And now all I'll say here is that this argument is terrifically suspect because we're introducing a very complicated apparatus of two-dimensional semantics in order to explain how conceivability is an absolute problem for materialism. But let's concede this. Chalmers is dang clever and he deserves to be getting paid good money, because this is not the kind of trickery that just anybody can come up with. It takes a lot of hard noggin. So I explained it in the best way that I could. If any of this is confusing to you, don't worry about it. This is sort of next level complicated. This is like level 2 metaphysics, level 3 metaphysics, and we're sort of trying to stay in level 1 for most of the semester, but we can do 1.5. Maybe we can get to 2. So if you understand this, great. If you want to talk about that more, great. I would love to chat about this with you outside of class. So thank you for keeping up. Okay. So let's talk about type C materialism. That's the one thing we haven't talked about. Type C materialism says that the epistemic gap is closable in principle. Zombies may one day not be conceivable. We just need to work on the science some more, and then we'll understand why we were dumb to think zombies were ever conceivable. Mary right now seems to lack some crucial information that she can't get from textbooks, but maybe one day we'll be able to understand how we can produce textbooks where she wouldn't lack this information, or she'd be able to do a certain kind of experiment that would allow her to grasp and understand red and not be surprised when she saw an apple. But like, we don't have that information yet. We don't have a complete neuroscience or a complete cognitive science. It's still up in the air for us. So type C materialism says that one day we'll have the epistemic gap closed, or if we can't ever close the epistemic gap, the type C materialist thinks that can be explained by our limitations as humans, but not by a metaphysically essential feature of the world. So the view held by type C materialists suggests that we have psychological limitations that can be overcome by science, or that can't be, but that doesn't mean that the problem is unsolvable altogether. Some type C materialists also think that the problems held by these epistemic arguments just beg the question against materialism. So some people think that the Mary thought experiment begs the question, that the zombie argument begs the question, because if you've already accepted materialism and materialist principles, you would just deny a lot of the premises of the argument because they're straightforwardly incompatible with the assumptions that you've already made. Chalmers thinks that these styles of views are, quote, inherently unstable, unquote, and that they ultimately collapse into one of the others. So type C materialism is basically a version of either type A materialism or type B materialism, but it can't decide. So like, right now, maybe they feel more like type B materialists, but they're basically saying that one day they will be type A materialists. And so type C materialism is almost not a necessary category for Chalmers. It's just either type A or type B, but it depends on like what time you're asking them. Chalmers also locates part of the problem with type C materialism with the deep, and he thinks inherent, limitations in the explanations that we get from physics and other physical sciences, which on his view always rely on the structure of things and the dynamics of things. And he thinks that structure and dynamics are two things that won't be able to account for our phenomenal structures and phenomenal character. So, you know, like if you describe atoms, you're describing them in terms of their structure and their dynamics, right? How they're arranged internally, how they're composed, and also how they interact with other objects, like other atoms or electrons and protons and neutrons and radiation and all these things. But if you describe the structure and dynamics, and you describe the structure and dynamics all the way up toward the mental isn't essentially structural or dynamical. It's got this phenomenal character, and it won't be sufficiently explained by the kinds of ontological posits, I guess, that are in physics. And so Chalmers just thinks that the type C materialist is thinking that one day, like, the solution is in sight, but if they continue relying on these structural and dynamical explanations, they're never going to make it. So he's saying, like, their optimism is unjustified. Our scientific concepts just aren't the kinds of concepts that can explain phenomenal experience. All right, so in closing, and I don't have time to discuss each of these in detail, but fret not, everybody. We will talk about the ones of these that we have not talked about next time. So basically, this last one in this category, type F monism, that's what our entire next class is going to be on. And the first two, type D dualism and type E dualism, we've talked about a little bit already. So the alternative views, suppose that you agree with Chalmers that materialism is dead and you don't want to do anything anymore with materialism. You just feel crushed that the scientists couldn't solve it and they're not going to be able to solve it, and consciousness is just too special. Well, type D dualism is a very attractive first option. This is the Cartesian option. It's a kind of interactionist dualism. So microphysics is not causally closed. You have this other substance. It's the mental substance. The mental substance has the explanation of your feelings and your experiences and all that good stuff, and your thoughts. And your thoughts and your experiences and your feelings can causally interact with the physical. Very classic view. Hard to go wrong with it. Well, no, that's not true. We've talked about ways that it can go wrong, and we will continue to talk about ways that dualism can go wrong. So that's option one. Option two is type E dualism. Type E dualism is epiphenomenalism, basically, on which the psychophysical laws run in one direction only. So the physical can cause mental stuff to happen, but the mental stuff has no causal powers. And the phenomenal properties are just sort of byproducts of the other stuff that's going on. They're like evolutionary bonuses, but they have no job. Also, a possible view you could have, less attractive, but cheaper. Very, very cheap to buy with your ontological points, right? Because you're getting an extra ontological thing, but you don't need it for explanations, and it's sort of like not subject to the same argumentative problems as materialism, because you essentially get the view from a couple of arguments. You just follow the arguments where they lead, and they'll lead you to epiphenomenalism. So in a sense, it's a cheap view to buy, not as expensive as type D dualism, not as classic, maybe a little more controversial. But if you're poor, philosophically, that's a place you can go. Okay, so the last view, lots of razzle dazzle, very special, not so classic, but maybe interesting, is type F monism. Type F monism includes the view that Chalmers calls Russellian monism, but also it includes pan-proto-psychism, on which the intrinsic properties of fundamental physical entities are phenomenal properties. So for more on this, we're going to talk about it next time. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed this paper. I'll see you again soon.